Hey everybody, hope you're all doing well. My name is Steven, and this is the Storytime channel. Today we have some malicious compliance stories, and our first story of the day is by Intergalactic Toast. Only wear items of clothing that the school allows? No problem, Mr. Nonce. I was a one-man army against school policy at my school. A lot of the policy was harmful towards poorer students, or just did not make sense, and my spectrum brain couldn't handle the stupidity. I was on a thread and recalled the story of a battle between me and one of the bully teachers at the school. One time I didn't want to go to school because my shoes had holes in them. My mom let me wear my trainers and sent me with a note, but she had bad handwriting, so they thought I faked it. One of the teachers started quoting the dress code at me and threw away my note when I gave it to them. They brought some manky shoes from Lost and Found and tried to make me wear them, so I straight up told them to freak off. It pissed him off, so he tried to grab my foot and force one on, so I screamed, "Sir's a nonce, he's inappropriately touching me." And while the other students found it hilarious, he didn't, so I got an in-school suspension. He ran the isolation wing, so I ended up going and sitting in this room with him and some others. But the ridiculousness of the whole thing made me completely disillusioned with his authority. Him throwing away my note and grabbing my foot made me fully convinced he didn't give a crap about the policy he was enforcing. So why should I? Started swinging my chair and singing loudly, and he told me to stop, so I told him to freak off. He asked if I wanted to be sent home, so I said, "No crap, I wanted to be sent home. That's where all my games and crap were." He said I was there to learn the rules, so sit down and shut up. And I said if I was in there for breaking the rules, why the freak would I follow them now? He said that kind of talk would end up putting me in prison. So I said, "So would touching kids, you freaking nonce." That was the last straw, and he sent me home for the day. I spent the day brushing up on school policy. Turns out for a uniform violation, you're supposed to get a warning. I came back the next day wearing the wrong jumper. He yelled at me. I showed him the policy. He warned me and said he didn't want to see any jumper or shoes that weren't school uniform. So I came back next day wearing different trousers. He yelled at me again. So naturally I asked him to be specific about what he wanted me to wear. He said if it was in the school policy, I could wear it. Great! I started coming in gym clothes and trainers. The same trainers from before. Turns out there's a whole separate uniform for gym days, and most people change on the day, but there is no rule that says you have to, or that you can't wear the uniform on other days. He tried to take me to see the head teacher when he saw me, thinking it was grounds for expulsion, but I was an otherwise good kid grade-wise, so the head teacher asked why I wasn't complying. I said I was just simply confused about the policy. The headmaster took some time to explain it to me while I patiently waited for him to finish. Then I innocently inquired as to what the school's policy was around destruction of personal property or touching other students below the belt. Apparently, it's absolutely not allowed. Not even a note. Asked if the same rules applied to teachers. It did. So I turned around and asked the other teacher, "So why did you put your hands on me and try to physically force me to change? And why did you destroy my note?" Headmaster looked at the teacher looked at me, then him, then me. Headmaster asked for the room, so I stepped outside. Don't really know what was said, but there was about 10 minutes of yelling, and then I was invited back in. Headmaster asked for the full story, so I gave it to him, including my insubordination, etc. And the whole time, the headmaster was shooting daggers at the other teacher. Turns out the other teacher didn't have nearly as much authority as he claimed he did. When he sent students home, he had been altering their files to mark them as absent for the day and had been going behind the headmaster's back to dole out extra punishments. Nobody else had questioned his authority before because he was a bit of a bully, and I'd been the first one stubborn enough to call him on his BS. He didn't get fired, but he got some kind of formal warning, and I was allowed to keep wearing gym clothes as a special exception on mental health grounds. Looking back, I'm fairly confident that it was a bribe so we wouldn't sue or report the teacher. Do you think in situations where there is a formal process on how to handle this, in regards to punishing the teacher, starting with formal warning, then maybe suspension, then maybe firing, that in this case, it should have just gone straight to firing them? Let me know in the comments down below. Our next story is by Nothing to See Here. Bury an old water tower to use as an emergency shelter? Sure, what could go wrong with that? So this actually happened to my dad a few years ago. He lived in an area right along the Texas/Oklahoma border in a fairly rural area. My dad primarily worked in pipeline construction. One day, my dad noticed someone had purchased a very large property not too far down the road. Turns out that the new neighbor was actually from the suburbs around Columbus, Ohio, and had just won a lottery prize. The man hadn't won the jackpot, but had won a smaller prize around $2 million. My dad was also originally from Ohio, so he decided to say hello. A few days later, he meets the lotto neighbor. We'll call him Jim. Jim starts telling my dad about his dream to build his own self-sustaining homestead far away from the rest of society. Jim was very interested in prepping and convinced of a soon-to-come global societal collapse. He used his lotto winnings to purchase the land and begin building his homestead. My dad honestly didn't find this that odd because many people in the area had some tendency towards independence, and those prepping shows were popular at the time. About a year later, Jim reached out to my dad to ask for help with a construction project that involves burying a large water tower in the ground. My dad is a little confused but decided to go take a look. Turns out Jim bought an old water tower, about 15 feet in diameter and about 15 feet high, for the purpose of reusing it as an underground shelter. Jim had recently completed the build of a prefab home on his property and wanted the water tower buried partially under the new home with a trap door built in the closet to access it. My dad immediately thought this was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard and proceeded to tell Jim all the potential issues with his plan. Jim cut him off and told my dad that his contractor for the home had basically told him the same, and so had several others he'd contacted to try and get them to bury this water tower. However, Jim believed this was simply laziness on their part and had the utmost confidence in his plan. My dad left, but a day or so later, Jim contacts him again and asks about paying my dad to let him rent some construction equipment he had on his own property. My dad again goes over with him what a bad idea this is and how no legitimate crew would ever do this for him. Jim brings up using my dad's equipment and illegal laborers. My dad decides, well, if he's determined, might as well make a few bucks off lotto winner Jim. He quotes him some ridiculous price to rent his equipment and says he can ask a guy at work he knows about gathering up a group of Mexican day laborers. Jim agrees to the crazy price, and my dad gets in touch with a Mexican friend who had a crew of day laborers. A bit later, my dad asks his friend about how the project is going. He tells my dad how nasty Jim treated the workers, how stupid the whole plan is, and how his specifications for how he wanted this built were completely idiotic. Whenever they'd offer up suggestions or point out why something he wanted was wrong, he'd essentially shut them down and use a bunch of slurs for Mexicans. So they buried the water tower and built his secret entrance exactly as he wanted, knowing it was completely stupid. He mentioned they only completed the job because Jim was paying them way more than they were used to making. Everyone agreed Jim was a jerk, but all the more reason to gouge your prices and take his money. A year or so goes by when my dad gets a frantic call from Jim. It had rained quite a bit, which was unusual for the area. And now the entire ground floor area of the back of his home was bowed upward about 2 feet. My dad goes to Jim's and takes a look around, realizing what had happened. Given that they had essentially just buried a large hollow object underneath his home, the rain caused the water tower to be pushed upward and right through his first floor. My dad explained the situation, and Jim immediately lost it, started ranting about how he should have never used those Mexican laborers and how he was gonna make them come fix it. My dad mentioned how that was probably impossible since most of them go back and forth across the border, but Jim was livid. My dad later found out from Jim that his insurance would not cover the damage to his home because he had buried a water tower under it without telling anyone. He mentioned trying to sue the insurance company, but that went nowhere. He also tried numerous times to find the day laborers, but was told you get what you get when you hire illegal workers to do a project that would have never have gotten a permit. Over the months afterwards, there was a lot of fallout for Jim, and he couldn't even live in his home anymore due to the damage. It eventually was torn down to be able to remove the water tower from beneath it. He burned through his lotto winnings pretty fast, so he didn't have anything left to rebuild it. He ended up selling the land and moving away about a year later. I just think if every contractor you go to tells you that that's a bad idea, and your only option left is illegal labor, maybe you should begin to heed what they have to say. But considering this dude was wanting to bury a water tower because they were afraid the end of the world was near, they probably aren't too fond of listening to people with good advice. Our next story is by ZJH31. Woman blocks her sidewalk with a car, asks us to call the police. My neighbor blocked the sidewalk with her car during the last 2 snowstorms. This meant 1, so she claims she didn't have to shovel a path from her car to her house and instead was able to step directly on her shoveled sidewalk, which she pays someone to shovel, and could then walk to her front door, and 2, she didn't need to shovel the sidewalk that her car blocked because no snow landed there, and 3, she didn't shovel the sidewalk between her car and the edge of her property, about 2 feet, because once people have to walk around her car in the street, who cares about the last couple of feet? She shoveled the sidewalk into the driver's side of the car, but not the passenger side. So my wife politely knocked on her door, explained that forcing our kids to walk around her car meant they walked in the street and that wasn't safe, therefore could she please drive her car fully into her driveway as required by law? The law doesn't permit someone to block a sidewalk. We didn't want to make this into a big deal, but us neighbors asked if she could be a normal human. The woman said no, then claimed it wasn't safe for her to pull all the way into her driveway because that would force her to step in snow. My wife said if that was a concern, she should shovel a path on her grass from her driveway to her front door. The woman then claimed she is not feeling well. My wife pointed out that she did this 2 months ago during the last snowstorm and that she goes to work daily. If she was really sick, she'd be stuck in the house. Additionally, not feeling well doesn't preclude a person from parking in their own driveway or walking in snow. My wife said she would call the police, not an emergency line. The neighbor says, "Go ahead," and she'd get a doctor's note. So we did. The police said they would drive over. We didn't see whether the police chatted with her or not. Either way, she got a ticket for blocking the sidewalk. She did shovel the 2 feet of sidewalk. I suspect the police did speak to her and reminded her that not shoveling a sidewalk is a fine from the building department, not the police, and if we were willing to call the police, we'd probably call the building department too. We had planned on it, but they were closed on the weekend when this happened. She now pulled further up, still partially blocking the sidewalk, but at least we don't need to walk around in the street. Of course, if she does this again, we won't be asking her politely to move the car, and we'll call the police instead. Not that entertaining, but ask us to call the police, happy to. Honestly, I think this is the kind of situation where you don't even need to keep arguing about it. If you ask them nicely the first time and they say outright no, and you know they're breaking the law, just go straight to that non-emergency call. It's not worth the grief or the stress trying to deal with people like that. And our final story of the day is by Get a Grip of This. Get me in trouble for being 5 minutes late, but not for showing up? Fine. I used to work at a food service place in Canada. Think coffee. My location had this rule that you would absolutely get written up if you were late over 2 minutes, but you would not get in any form of trouble if you called out. This is especially important because I lived an hour each way from where I worked, and the roads could be treacherous in the winter. One occasion, it was especially bad and I was exactly 5 minutes late. I didn't even get to clock in before I was in the office getting reamed out for my terrible insubordination. I confirmed the policy and refused to sign the write-up. About 2 months later, the same situation comes back round. I arrive in the parking lot and I look around to see the absolute demonic blizzard taking place. The clock showed me I had 2 minutes until shift started. Since they wanted to play that game, I called from the parking lot to tell them I wouldn't be in. The roads were just too bad. I didn't get in an amoeba of trouble for it. Soon, everyone learned the same thing as I did, and callouts were frequent. Nobody in management has ever figured out why. I understand having some kind of policy for people being late, but being 2 minutes late to start your shift? Really? Some coffee place is not that important that you have to be there within 2 minutes of clocking in time. That's just ridiculous. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. So if you have a favorite story of the day, let me know which story and why in the comments down below. But besides that, if you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, and if you haven't, subscribe and turn notifications on so you'll never miss an upcoming video. No matter what you do, whether it's just viewing the video, liking, subscribing, turning notifications on, I appreciate the heck out of it. Every little thing that you do helps the channel grow that much more, and I can't thank you enough for it. So, until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll be right here next time on the Storytime channel.